What's your preferable size of a sprint?
2 weeks.
Oh, God bless you.
If your sprint is too long, they tend to waterfall the sprint.
Yeah.
Right. So you take a 3-week sprint, they do design, they do analysis, they do build. It's like, no.
Hi, this is your project management cowboy coming back to you with another podcast with a formidable PM Cowboy this time. Roy Schilling, a colleague of mine, a guy I love to have discussion with. He's one of those types of guys that I will say this. I consider myself a somewhat expert on the subject matter of Agile, but Roy takes the cake. Roy beats me hands down. And what I love about Roy is you can have really critical discussion about Agile, and he'll very, very charmingly point out where some of your thought flaws on Agile is and set you straight. He's just a really all-around great guy and colleague of mine. So welcome to the PM Cowboy Podcast, Roy. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mark. And, thank you for that introduction. I don't know if I can follow that.
I'm sure you won't have any trouble. Roy, we have a kind of a tradition, a kind of basic framework of how we run this podcast. One of the things I always like to ask my guests is, in case viewers are wondering who the heck are these two guys, or where the heck do they know each other from? Where do we know each other from?
So we've done a lot of work together, at least, through a similar vendor. Yeah. And we've had many connections when we worked at or presented at the Dubai International Project Management Forum, where we have lots of good debates, lots of discussions,
exactly, shared
our stories. Yeah. And that's generally where we know each other from.
Yeah. And that's kind of what led into, hey, we definitely need to do something together, right?
Absolutely.
So I've kind of introduced you already as an expert on Agile, but you've got a long CV. And I always think when I will look at podcasts, one of the next questions I always ask myself, who is this guy talking? What's his background? How can I, in what bucket or what background elements are important to know about him? And I think that's always great if the viewer kind of gets an overview. I like to call it the passion journey. So maybe you can give us a rundown of how did you end up doing or being what you are now, and maybe you'll end up by saying, what is your formal title or function right now?
You got it. So my journey that got me to this point started out years and years, really, really long time ago. Started out as a software developer, and came out of that, and I was eventually a manager, and then I became a coach, and we'll go into that in just a minute. I was working as a developer for a long time. I was practicing some of these things, and then eventually became a manager and did a lot of work in the banking field. And if you've been in the finance space, if you know much about the regulatory finance space, it is heavy process.
Do you have Basel in the States as well, or just Sarbanes-Oxley?
We've got yes, we have both, actually. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And lots of others.
And lots of other
regulations. Yeah. And on top of all that, banks are historically and notoriously traditional. I mean, like ultra traditional, not just like what we're used to with good PM practice, like ultra traditional. Yeah. And it really didn't work so well for me. Right. And didn't really, we were failing miserably in delivering and things like that. So I started searching for alternatives and landed in the Agile space and decided to take my career elsewhere since there really wasn't much of a future. 2008 happened. Let's be honest. Yeah. 2008, it was time to get out of banking.
That was a big ringer for all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So then I moved into the consulting space doing Agile coaching. Mm-hmm. So I got here. I've been practicing Agile in various forms for probably around 20 years now. And been coaching organizations for pretty close to almost 15, right around the 2008 range, right, about 15 years. So now my job is I'm obviously an Agile trainer, and technically my title is an enterprise transformation coach.
Ooh,
not really specifically about Agile. It's more about, and we're going to get into some of the specifics, Agile versus agility. Yeah. It's much more about agility and lean and transforming organizations, different ways of thinking. Right. So it's less about Scrum and Kanban and that kind of stuff, and more about the bigger picture.
I was going to ask you because I think too few people are aware of this. Is there a leaning of Agile? Is there a type of Agile that you prefer or that you've been exposed to? Because Crystal, Kanban, all those Scrum Ban. I just had somebody today ask me, hey, what's the difference? And I said, pretty much the same with different words.
Pretty much the same thing, yeah, just different type. And there's Kanban with a cadence and Scrum with there's like an infinite number of varieties. So I'm a huge lean fan. Love
awesome.
lean.
Awesome.
Waste, eliminating the waste, finding efficiencies and things like that. Along that, I use Kanban to help with that. But I also, where necessary, we use Scrum, right? Because Scrum is all of these are tools in the toolbox, right?
Yeah.
You use
so you basically use it at whatever fits the situation, the context.
Exactly right.
Awesome.
Exactly right.
Great.
Yep.
Great. Why are you in this space? So I'm still missing the passion. You did a perfect rundown, perfect bullet point, but I know you well enough. There's some passion in there.
There's passion.
You couldn't be who you are if there wasn't some kind of passion involved in there.
They're really, that's, Mark, it's a really important point, is that to be in this space and to be in our space, you have to have passion in what you're doing, because if you don't, great, you're going to deliver, you're going to do some good stuff, but there's no fun, you're not making any change, you're not making a difference. And you really have to have some passion in what you're doing. And absolutely, I've got passion in this. So when I was in the banking space, I just noticed the monumental failures, the organizational challenges, the poor behaviors. I'm going to be very, me, Mark, I'm going to be very blunt about some things. Lack of leadership. An absolute lack of leadership. Leaders taking us down the wrong direction. And I thought there's got to be a better way. I hated just doing the same thing over and over again and following, having the same failures. So that's what brought me to Agile. It's more about empowerment and people doing the work and treating people with respect.
Yeah.
Just that simple thing. That's not
some common sense stuff.
Yeah, right.
Some
it's
common
about
sense
humans, and that's what kind of got me there.
Yeah. Now, when you worked in the banking space, I'm assuming that most of your projects were IT related.
Oh yeah. Almost all of them were IT in the banking space. Yes.
Now,
exactly.
we could ask the Gartner Group or the Standish Group what their top 10 reasons are for failing at projects, but I've always noticed when I look at their list, the causes for project failure are always services that they offer in their consulting program. Your project manager needs to be trained. You need a spiffy enterprise software.
Are you saying consultants aren't always obvious and honest about their desire and how they're leading people? Is that what you're saying, Mark? I don't know.
Sometimes, yeah. So let me ask you a question. If from your perspective, what were some of the main driving forces of failure, and what types of failures did you have in your project?
Yeah, so
hold on a second. Hold on, let me close the mailing program. Should I ask the question again, or? Okay, we'll cut off there. So ready? Okay, here we go. All you.
Okay.
So the question was, why did projects fail?
Why do projects fail? So we had, a lot of the same reasons that most projects fail. One of the biggest challenges, quite honestly, is lack of clarity, lack of understanding of what success is going to look like. Mm-hmm. Why are we even doing the project? That's a huge one. And that's especially from a lean background. Why are we even doing some of the work that we're doing is huge. Poor requirements, misunderstanding of requirements, unrealistic expectations of deadlines, poor leadership, lack of leadership, where people aren't there to support you and to remove problems. We could go on and on. The problems that we've seen, I'm sure, Mark, you've seen them 1,000 times yourself. They're always the same reasons, right?
Yeah. It's interesting that you say it, because I have a little bit of a bank background. I was my first large project that I worked on. I've actually interviewed the former project manager and the project office manager from that project in my third podcast. Was a multi-million euro project, fusion of the two largest banks in Austria. And we were actually fairly successful. We used more of a predictive methodology. And then for about 20 years, I was kind of the go-to trainer for another bank that was building up a PMO. And then I trained a great majority of their staff. And interesting enough, I'd like to hear your feedback on this too. That bank also had this in the matrix perspective of thing. They had kind of the three-dimensional matrix attitude. They had the line organization, they had the project organization, and then they had their their change organization kind of embedded
Yeah.
in between the two. And they
And like
originally started off
operations and
with
change. Yeah.
process management and then process reengineering.
Sure.
Then they did Six Sigma, and I was like, why are you doing Six Sigma? That's kind of a
Yeah,
weird
I've
place
had
to
some
do it in the
experience with
bank.
those transformations too.
And then they went to Lean,
yeah.
and then they went to Agile Tribes, and that's where I thought they
Yeah.
went overboard. Because
Completely.
I don't know what a traditional bank has to do with Spotify methodology.
Spotify doesn't have anything to do with the Spotify methodology. It doesn't exist. We can get into that later, right?
We'll get into that. So, but one of the things I kind of noticed in this banking space where I was there for 20 years, my key question to them is, I understand if you want to do Kaizen, if you want to continuously improve your process, but I kind of felt that they were just reinventing the wheel every couple of years.
Yeah.
Investing a lot of time and training into new concepts, which are all very similar.
Very.
Yeah. And I said, your key measurement should be, are your projects successful? And I found, strangely, differing to the bank where you were, I felt that most of their IT projects pretty much came in spot on. So I was wondering, why would they go to such a radical concept of Spotify?
Yeah, quite honestly, they really shouldn't have, because it's just not the right model for finance organizations.
Yeah. Do we want to kind of give the viewers an idea of what the Spotify model is? Because I think it's kind of the pinnacle of agile expectation. And maybe we can go from that and then kind of go into the discipline agile, which kind of continues on that wave.
Yeah, and then we could talk about some of the other frameworks too, like SAFe and things like that as well. So Spotify, and I want to give real credit with this. They did an amazing job with this. Mm-hmm. It worked extremely well for them. I'm going to use past tense, right? Because that's how they started. It worked extremely well for them. And basically, the Spotify model is they created these teams and they called them tribes. And they have guilds and they have all kinds of different
squads.
Quite honestly, squads, exactly. They have some cool names, right? It was revolutionary. It was different. And that was part of the success, is that it was so out there, right? So it worked really well for them. But keep in mind, at the time there were a small, homogenous organization with one product, and it's a
major startup flavor.
So yes, absolutely, those kinds of things are going to work really, really well for them. But if you look at them now, they don't follow that model anymore.
Well, they used to have this principle of, for example, they didn't have business cards, they didn't have business title, there was no hierarchy. Yeah. It kind of followed this holacratic principle that was fashionable in Europe for a while, but I haven't heard anything about them in a long time either. But they just kind of outgrew it. I think they had the sophomoric attitude that this was going to revolutionize the world, and I was like, yeah, you're generation 342 that's thinking that.
Yeah.
And like I said, I agree with you. I think the Spotify model was spot on for when they started.
But
not even Spotify is using the Spotify method anymore.
No,
they've grown.
And that's a good agile, and I'm going to use that, like, good agile organization should not be the same thing 5 years down the road, 10 years. They should be changing. Yeah. And I'm going to give them lots and lots of credit. They changed like they should. They outgrew it and they moved to a different model.
Well, I think with size comes a different challenge of structure and framework. 100%. And whether you like it or not, you're going to borrow from what's been around for over 100,000 years or 10,000 years or whatever. Is kind of that, that vertical and horizontal distribution of responsibility. Yeah. It's funny because I saw on Instagram the other day, I saw an interview with Steve Jobs, and I was cracking up. I was really biting my tongue. And he was basically saying, Apple was so innovative. And so he didn't use the word agile because that wasn't the in word back then.
At the time, yeah.
But he was basically saying, as they grew, they thought they needed managers, so they hired some. And it was a disaster because besides managing, they couldn't do anything. And they went back to subject matter experts. And I was saying, you know what, Steve, are you listening to yourself? Because what are you good at? Nothing. Yeah. You're an expert on design and fonts.
Yes.
You don't know how to program. You don't have a software background. You don't know crap. So what do you do? Yeah. You're a manager.
He is. He had good vision. And he was
brilliant.
Brilliant.
He was brilliant. I really have this issue when we beat up on the management aspect of things. I think you can get a waterhead and have too many resources in one area. You need to create a balance. but
Absolutely.
there's a purpose and a reason for what I call that gray workforce. You know, the workforce in the background that everybody misunderstands, but kind of integrates and coordinates and stuff like that.
Yeah. And the reality is you need all of that. You know, you need people that do, you need your subject matter experts. And at some point in time in your growth, if you're a small company growing to a larger company, you're going to need to grow up. You're going to need to act like an adult.
Yeah.
You're going to need
You're going to have to get business cards.
You got to have business cards. Exactly. You're going to have to do those things.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the classic founder story.
Yeah.
You know, they start out with this founder and it's like, you know, destroy the world and we're going to revolutionize. And then eventually you grow up and you become an adult.
Yeah.
And then you've got people to deal with and HR issues and policies. You have to have those things or you collapse.
Yeah.
Right. It's just that simple.
Let's move on to the subject of disciplined agile. I think a lot of listeners will probably never have heard this about disciplined agile. A couple might be experts, a couple might even be certified. I think there's a small percentage of people who've kind of started working their way through it. I have a little bit. I got that book, Defining Your Wow, which was cute. I found some very interesting concepts in there. Can you kind of enlighten us? What is the disciplined agile all about? Because it also kind of leads into the topic of scaled, right?
Yeah, that's literally what it's about. Disciplined agile is one of the several scaling techniques.
So
and
there's safe,
pretty good.
There's
safe,
less, and there's
less,
disciplined, and a couple
disciplined
others.
Agile.
Probably.
There's also Scrum at Scale. There's several others out there.
Scrum
Maybe
of Scrum.
Scrum at Scale is another scaling technique.
Yeah.
And these are all different ways of basically taking small teams, individual teams, and scaling up with complexity, right?
So what's for those of us who are asking, what the hell do you need that for?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So, so a little history lesson with Agile, and where Agile made a whole bunch of mistakes at the beginning. We started out in Agile where it was focused on the team. You know, build a great team and you're going to have great stuff. I completely 100% believe in that.
Yeah.
Still believe in that. It's about the people. Build a great team. They're going to build great stuff.
Yeah.
But sooner or later, when you're a larger organization, you need to have more capacity than one team.
Yeah. And they were kind of theoretically limited to the principle of 7 plus or minus 2, right?
Exactly.
But the question is, can you manifest a multi-million euro project or multi-million dollar project with 7 people? And the answer is no.
No, of course not. Absolutely. I mean, you can, but it might take you 30 years. Right. So yes, absolutely. There's a capacity, right? So when you're in those situations, you need, larger groups of people. You need more capacity.
Yeah.
And when you're increasing capacity, you can do the traditional approach, which is you build bigger teams, or you can do the agile approach, which is you build multiple teams, right? Multiple 7 plus or minus 2 size teams. Now, the challenge though is once you start building multiple teams, and you go back to a core concept in Agile is removing silos, right? So you want to remove these silos, and that's why we build these cross-functional teams and things like that, because they work together really well in these small groups. But once you start building out multiple teams, what you're essentially doing is creating brand new silos.
You're replicating them. And that's what squads and guilds in reality, just with different names.
Yep.
Same problems, same solution with different names.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where the scaling frameworks come in. And the very simplest scaling framework is something called the Scrum of Scrums.
Okay.
Right. And the Scrum of Scrums is if you have 2, maybe 3 teams, you don't need a lot of complexity to organize those teams. We just want them to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Right. Make sure that we're not building brand new silos. So we build this opportunity on a regular cadence where teams talk to each other and they talk about the challenges they're facing and what impediments they have and, how to coordinate. Right. It's important stuff. It's really very valuable. Yeah. But once you get beyond that, now that complexity starts to set in and you've got a lot more stuff to deal with. Now you're talking more program, right? And, contrary to popular belief, programs and portfolios exist in an Agile organization too. It doesn't go away.
Do PMOs exist? Are they called VDOs? I think that's a venereal disease, isn't it?
Yes, it's right. It's in PMO. It's not a good word, right? So that's when we have that level of complexity where you need the extra capacity, you have to have something to make sure the teams are coordinated properly, that we've system view, not just individual team view. We've got architects and, program activities, right? So that's where your scaling techniques, that's the second level of scaling techniques, right? Versus Scrum of Scrums.
Well, you have to create synergies, of course. You might have discussions like, do I need a Scrum Master for each squad, or do I use
the design
multiple squads?
Of the program.
which is a
Yep.
conversation that I have on a continual basis with people. And I say, whatever you need, you have to be able to define it based on your needs
Exactly.
and not on what the rules say.
Exactly right. And I think that's a key point you just made there, Marcus. It's not about the rules, right? It's you do what's right for you. You use the rules as guidelines, not as necessarily rules. So there are some rules don't break, of course, right? Most of them are more, make it work for you.
Yeah.
Find a way of building the situation that's best for you, right?
Now, there's two things that I picked up out of this Discipline Agile book that came from PMI, and I'm always I have a reputation for being an outspoken critic of things that I somewhat understand, and the purpose of me being critical of it is kind of me saying I don't get it. I see a flaw. Where's the solution? Somebody tell me, or I'm going to keep harping on this. Right? Some things you're very good at clarifying. Other things remain because you agree with me. So that's kind of confirmation. Yes. There's two interesting things I picked up out of the book, and that's this acronym WOW.
Yes, way of working.
Yeah, way of working, which I think is very sexy marketing language. And I was reading it, and I don't know if I read it wrong, but this is what it basically said. The book basically said there's many different ways of doing Agile. There's many different ways of doing hybrid or predictive. I don't think they even referred to predictive so much. But they basically said that you as a sponsor or whatever the heck you want to call it then, a product owner, should basically talk to your team or allow your team to self-organize and define what is their preferential way of working.
Yeah, and I agree with that to an extent. It's not just preferential. I also like to say what is actually going to work. Okay. Because a team might elect, I don't want any framework. I don't want any, and you can't have that.
Now, that's exactly what triggered me, because I've tried to create like this historical evolution model of the different change methodologies and the different project management methodologies.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of time, and I'm in a startup project right now for an NGO, for a nonprofit organization.
Excellent.
And it's really fun. And we are completely chaotic and unorganized. And
that's the best.
And the funny thing is, it has to do in a medical services field. And I know nothing about medical services. So my primary function for everybody else who's chaotic is to bring a framework to bear.
Exactly.
Right?
It's manage chaos.
Yes.
Right? Chaos is good.
At the end, projects are chaos. Project management is managing chaos and realizing opportunities
100%.
and mitigating risks. That's what project management is, right?
Exactly.
So what triggered me a little bit about this statement, ask the team for their way of working. I can empathize with that in a small organization where there's not a lot of standardization.
Yeah.
But at the very beginning of this evolution curve of change or project management, I always say the very origin of every startup company, and this includes Spotify and the startup company that I'm helping now, is what I call anarchic agility. That I don't think the term has been coined before, but it's my academic way of saying.
Do you want to trademark that? That's good, right?
TM.
There you go.
I like to say, when I do seminars, I often ask people who's working in projects. A lot of people raise their hands. I say, who's been trained before? Not a lot of them.
There's a problem, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, hold on. And then I say, okay, who's working in project, has not been trained? This is the last question is for you. Are your projects successful? And most of them raise their hand.
Yes.
And I applaud them. I say, thank you for being honest. And I kind of have this drop the mic thing where, okay, you don't need the seminar, go home. They all laugh, ha, ha, ha. And I said, well, why are you here if you're managing projects and you're successful? And what basically comes to bear is, as long as you're working on a small project and it's only a handful of people, anarchic agility is a wonderful process. But the larger your organization gets, the bigger your programs are, the bigger your portfolio is. I really have an issue with this work any which way you want, because I think it's a license to do nothing. Would you agree?
Yes, I 100% agreed. And I think we can both agree that philosophically, working any way you want to is a great idea, right? Yeah. If the team can properly choose a process that works for them, what's wrong with that, right? Yeah. Nothing. The problem is that at the beginning, they don't have enough knowledge to know what is the right framework for them. And this is, I'm gonna say this also. This is also another big challenge in the Agile community. And I talk about this all the time. I'm sure some coaches are, pretty annoyed when I say this thing. When you first start out with a team, you can't just let them make any decisions they want to. You have to give them guidance, sometimes direction.
They expect it from you, actually.
Yes, exactly. And you think about it, like, just to your point, they don't know what they're doing yet. So they're like looking for guidance.
Well, they don't want to focus on, they really don't want to spend their time with framework.
No.
They appreciate it.
Yes.
But they don't want to have to deal with the administrative part of the project. They just want to know, listen, because what we're also addressing here, especially if you're talking about Scrum of Scrum or the more scaled version.
Yeah.
What does it mean if you've got 7 squads all using a different wow?
Yeah.
There's no synergy.
And you can, but there's got to be the appropriate mechanism across all those teams that they
there needs to be some form of, like, I don't know, translation, right? The Rosetta Stone. But even that is cumbersome. And my question is, isn't it less cumbersome to at least create, we're going to use Agile language here, right? Okay. Create the minimum viable process by which we do wow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, what that process is can be dependent upon the kind of work that a team is doing, but they need the guidance from people that have been through it before to make sure they understand this will work for you. This one's going to be not good for you at all. Like, just a quick example, Scrum versus Kanban. Right? So they are similar but different processes. There are many, many, many cases where Scrum would be miserable to implement for a particular kind of work. But so many organizations say, well, everyone must do Scrum because that's what everybody does.
Well, that's what 70% of the people who do Agile think Agile is.
Yeah, exactly, which is completely wrong, right? It's not about Scrum whatsoever. Scrum is just one of the mechanisms, right?
It's the most dominant one. Yeah,
it is the most dominant. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too, right? Because not as much anymore, right? Sorry to
I'd be interested to hear what you have to say there. Yeah,
definitely want to talk about that one. But Scrum versus Kanban. Some teams, Kanban's going to work brilliantly for them. Some teams, Scrum is going to work brilliantly. And there's some teams I wouldn't use Kanban because they don't have the discipline to do it well. So you have to kind of feel the team out, their context, their situation, and say, here's my suggestion to you. Here are your choices. Now team, now that you know enough, make your choice.
Can we, because we had this conversation this just January and February, and I was so happy that I finally had somebody who could answer my question, because I used to have a major pet peeve with this issue.
Scrum versus Kanban.
Yeah, the difference between, and then Scrumban. I mean, like, what the heck? Why are all these little villages constantly popping up and renaming themselves? What's the purpose of this? And let's take a look at it from a superficial perspective. From a superficial perspective, the main artifact, which is a silly name, by the way, as well, sounds like Indiana Jones digging in the sands of Egypt, pulling out the Rosetta Stone, right? Exactly. It's just a document. Okay. The central document of Scrum is a product backlog.
So let's back up. Yes, that is a primary artifact. There are 3 artifacts. Yeah. The product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment that you produce.
Okay, but isn't the sprint backlog part of the product backlog?
It's kind of a subset, right? It's kind of a subset. It's kind of like, to me, it's like a very small work breakdown structure. That's now, what
I always say about the product backlog, I don't think the name is very sexy, but this is what I say about the product backlog. It is the silliest, most idiotic concept I can think of. It's a to-do list in 3 columns, but before everybody gets their all excited and upset and start writing comments in the feed, at the same time, because of its simplicity, it is brilliant.
It is.
Okay. It's basically, what have we not done?
What are we
doing? And what are we going to do?
Yes.
Now, exactly. I asked you this because people used to always ask me, what's the difference between Kanban and the product backlog? And I used to say nothing except the name. But you corrected me. And I did know this. I did know that Kanban, from the process, and maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit, has a different workflow.
Very
and in fact,
you
said it doesn't even have a workflow. So maybe you can start off with a product backlog and remind people how does that work, and then we can compare the Kanban.
So the product backlog, as you mentioned, is actually a really good idea, and you can do a backlog in waterfall too. It's not just an agile thing, right?
Yeah,
you can do it, right? And let me say this also: I actually dislike the term product backlog, and the main reason, and I know it's going to be semantics a little bit, but it's not just about the product. You could be doing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with a product.
But isn't that the agile vision, though? They eliminate all what's called the project management scope and focus on product scope. It's all about features, right?
So let's go down that rabbit hole just a little bit, then we'll dig ourselves back out again. Okay. So here's the challenge for companies that actually have a product that makes sense, right? And yes, you could say that every company has a product. You can mutate it and say yes, every company has a product. But those companies, like let's take a bank as an example. A bank has a lot of internal systems, and those systems are more capabilities than they are products.
Yeah.
Right? So there are a lot of companies where the product mindset just doesn't really quite fit right.
Yeah.
And we try to force it by changing the definition of a product. As well, this service here, like that's really a product, and you get the idea. I think it gets messy, right? So I just prefer to call it a backlog. I know it's a simplification, but it's whatever work we need to do.
Hey, it's not a sexy terminology to begin with, so feel free to improve it.
Exactly. And even the word backlog has some negative connotation, like a backlog of stuff you're never going to get to.
Yeah, it means that you're stuck and you're not moving forward. Yeah.
Exactly. And that wasn't their intent, but that's kind of the way it comes up. All right. So let's talk now about the backlog. The backlog is an aggressively prioritized list of work that you're going to do now, next, later. Right. That kind of approach. Now, when I say aggressively prioritized, and this is the benefit of this backlog, there's one priority priority two, right? Not 10 priority ones.
Yeah.
And that's the real key. And this is not about about Agile. This is really just be smart and reduce your priorities, right? You should not have priorities. You should have priority. Right?
Well, I actually learned that you can, depending on the size of the things you're talking about, you create the first priority, kind of the triage, right?
Yes.
But that's something that you do at the beginning of your sprint planning session, so that you don't get smitten or overwhelmed by everything that's in that backlog, right? You say, hey, let's focus. Exactly. This is what we're focusing on, right?
This is the most important stuff that we want to work on. Yeah.
And then you basically have a team that projects into the sprint, right? And they start figuring out what each individual do per sprint.
Yeah. Essentially, yes, exactly. And now the key with the backlog again is it's aggressively prioritized, and that's for all kinds of good reasons. You want your team to focus. You don't want them, the stress of having 12 different things that are all the most important thing. They're getting yelled at because they're late. All the normal reasons, right? Single aggressively prioritized backlog. Now, that product backlog is actually quite similar with Kanban and Scrum. They both use the concept of a big to-do list, right?
That's a funnel that moves from left to right. That's where they're similar.
Yeah. Now, and also both Scrum and Kanban do have the concept that you need to keep your backlog managed well, right? Because if you don't manage that filter, that funnel coming into your process, then you could have things on that backlog that are 5 years old. It's not doing you any good. So it should be stuff that you have a reasonable certainty that you're going to work on.
So don't distract people with nice to haves that are just going to make you depressed all the time. Focus on what
I have an idea. Okay, we'll get the idea on there, but if it's been there for 6 months, your chances are you're not going to do it. So get rid of the stupid thing, right? Just be smart about it, right? And manage that backlog reasonably. Now, if we view that as the funnel coming into our process, now we talk about the difference between Scrum and Kanban, right? So they have this list of things to do. Scrum, the primary difference is Scrum is batch oriented, right? Meaning that we set a time box of 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks, 2 weeks.
So the classical sprint, right?
The sprint, exactly.
Or iteration. Let me ask you off the cue question.
Yeah.
What's your preferable size of a sprint?
2 weeks.
Oh, God bless you. See, you make me feel good about myself because I've been saying that and I don't know as much about it, but I'm like, anything that's larger than 2 weeks doesn't make sense to me because you have that classical effect that you have too much slack in there, right?
Yeah, and there's some other challenges, especially with newer teams. If your sprint is too long, they tend to waterfall the sprint.
Yeah.
Right. So you take a 3-week sprint, they do design, they do analysis, they do build. It's like, no.
That's when the product backlog all of a sudden doesn't have 3 columns. Now it has 12 columns, right?
Exactly. It out of control. 2 weeks. And you know, I think you and I both agree this. It's hard to get work done in 2 weeks. It's not easy, but that's by design. Right. Break your work down smaller, reduce the risk, reduce complexity, and you get more work done as a result. Right. So 2 weeks is my primary go-to. So break the work down, have a sprint, you get the work done within that time box, whatever time box you choose. It is expected that once you start the sprint, that you're not going to change the sprint, or at least you resist.
Yeah, it's a uniform set of time. Your releases can be at different intervals, but your sprint stays the same. It's like when you run, I have my favorite watch here that I don't use. It's a runner's watch, which basically the sprint here is 1 kilometer or 1 mile, right? How long does it take you to do it? Period.
System. Exactly. And we don't want to change the scope that's in that sprint. So fixed duration, you plan your 2 weeks. If you change your scope, your plan is gone.
So are you talking about WIP limits?
Not yet.
Okay, good.
There is an implicit, let me say it this way. There's an implied WIP limit in Scrum. There's physical WIP limits in Kanban. And WIP for the group, WIP is work in progress.
So how much you take from column 1 and put in column 2. And that is a social science completely unto itself. And if anybody thinks that they can do that with a process-oriented mindset, you are screwed. This is soft skills out the wazoo. You need a sensational, lateral thinking facilitator, scrum master, yabba dabba do master, whatever you want to call it, that basically coaches the team through that process. Otherwise, in my opinion, it doesn't work.
Yeah, and you can start Kanban in an hour, right? It's easy, but to get good at it, that takes time, right? And self-discipline, which is, and I'm a huge Kanban fan, but you got to have some level of self-discipline.
Well, when we're talking about WIP limits, we're still talking about more classical product backlogs, right?
That is correct. But the work that you have in process right now, that's the limits that you're going to want to set.
So now in Scrum, if I understood it correctly, the concept, so the big thing that I learned, what was the difference between Kanban and the product backlog when I Googled it, was your right to move work packages from the sprint backlog into the done file.
Yeah.
Now in classical sprint, if you commit to doing 3 user stories or 4 tasks or whatever it is that fits into the sprint, right? You do them, and at the end of the sprint, you say, I did the 4, and I ask you, could you have done more? And you say yes or no. And if you say yes, then we consider increasing the amount of workload that you theoretically could do. It's not an exact science, although they like to communicate it as that. But it's
not an exact science. It's
very far from it's more a crystal ball science.
Yeah, we use historical data, all this kind of good stuff to indicate what's possible, not say this is absolutely. It doesn't work like that.
But the only thing that I heard what was the difference was you have to wait till the end of the sprint in Scrum to move it. And Kanban, if you're finished with it, you move it over, which I thought made total sense. Why wouldn't you do that? And the awesome thing is, instead of waiting until the end of the sprint to say I could have done more, you just move it over and you say, give me some more to do, right? Now, but let me tell you something. I don't
constantly evaluate.
I don't think that different justifies creating 2 total different forms of Agile.
There's more. So
please,
so yes, if it was just that, then absolutely. They're so similar, who cares, right? But there is actually more, right? So one of the differences in Scrum, the assumption is you plan what you're going to work on, you get it done in the sprint, and at the end of the sprint, the work is done, right? How you get it done in the middle of that sprint is entirely up to the team. We don't spend a lot of time caring about it. You talk every day to make sure you're getting it, all that good stuff. But there's really no focus on flow. That's where Kanban comes in. That's the big difference. So with Kanban, you are focusing every single day, looking at things that are blocked, looking at what can we do to improve the flow of work to get it from start to finish as quickly as possible.
So that classical work chain flow, whatever it's called.
Yep, exactly.
Which is basically precedence diagram methodology.
Yeah, and exactly. And a lot of this comes from manufacturing. You think of manufacturing line, you want to get it from the first workstation to the last as quickly as possible.
Productive, non-productive time.
It's value add, non-value add. So
Yeah.
you're looking at all those spaces
Yeah.
between
Which
the
is
steps.
brilliant.
It works great,
Yeah.
right? So the focus of Kanban is very different from Scrum. Scrum is, here's your batch, you get it done by the end of the sprint, go on to the next batch.
Yeah.
Kanban, every single day we're looking at what's stopped, what can we do to get better, what can we do to move things along faster? Are we seeing things bottlenecking? So you're focusing on the flow of work to get it done as fast as possible. That's the key difference. And that's why there's also Scrum with Kanban. This is something that I use quite often.
Yeah.
Even in Scrum, I take some Kanban concepts of flow management and WIP limits and things like that to improve my Scrum framework, right? So they can go together.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me ask you, I think you told me that Kanban doesn't originally plan for a sprint.
It does not plan for a sprint at all.
So it's just continual workflow.
Continuous flow. It is literally continuous flow. You got your big old list.
Yeah.
You start working on something, you finish something, you go to the next one.
Yeah.
Just that.
Okay. Any other major differences?
Those are the big ones.
Yeah.
The way that you set up Kanban can be different as well. You have things like class of service. You measure. So actually, here's a big difference. The way you forecast and the way you measure is very, very different.
Okay.
Scrum, there's that primary, there's probably a metric called velocity, right?
Yeah.
Which is how much stuff you complete every sprint.
Yeah.
Kanban doesn't have a sprint, so you can't use that. It doesn't exist. So instead, you use cycle time and throughput. It's a different way of measuring and a different set of metrics that we're going to use to see how much stuff we can get done.
Okay, but then if you're using cycle time, you can only measure it on work that's interrelated.
Generally true. So what you look for in Kanban is work that is similar. You look for patterns.
Yeah.
They're work types. You got, let's say, one is you're building a report, and another type of work is you're installing a server. Very, very different kinds of work. They're going to have different kinds of cycle times, right? But if you measure the cycle time for each of those types of work, now you get more predictability.
Okay.
Like how long on average does it take you to install a server?
Yeah.
It should be somewhat consistent, right?
Okay, so let me ask you a question. For those of our viewers who are kind of getting interested now in Kanban, I sense a question that would pop up.
Bring it on. Let's do it.
And I think you have experience and can share your thoughts on this. When do you use Kanban? When do you use Scrum?
So you can use Kanban in pretty much any situation, right?
Yeah.
Scrum, less so. Right?
Okay.
So here's an example. Let's say that you have a very high volatility of requirements.
Yeah.
Every single day, the things that you're going to be working on are changing.
Yeah.
If you can't plan 2 weeks and keep that relatively non-volatile and consistent, Scrum's not going to work.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're doing like operations activities, if you're rolling out infrastructure, doing, working on office space, whatever it happens to be, there's no way you can plan out a full 2 weeks of work and expect that it's exactly what you planned is going to get done.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
So
right?
The more predictable, the more likely you would use Scrum?
Yes.
Okay.
If you have less volatile requirements, less ad hoc work, Scrum will work just fine for you.
Okay.
If you've got a lot of volatility in what you're working on day to day, it's going to be really, really challenging.
Okay. So Kanban is the more aggressive, the more hardcore version.
And it's also, interestingly, hardcore, absolutely, but it's also lighter weight.
Okay.
Right. So it's a very, very lightweight framework.
Because it's micro focused.
Exactly. You build a board, you set up your WIP limits, and you set some policies up, and you're up and running. Generally.
Ralph Stacey, the classical Ralph Stacey matrix, which I love.
Yeah.
I think his graphic is a great explanation to explain something that's complex in a simple way, and it even defines complexity as simple, complicated, complex, and oh my God,
chaos.
This is a nightmare. Chaos, right? And if you look at the Ralph Stacey matrix, he basically explains what type of project management evolution or methodology can best comply with that situation. Yes. By the way, there's one major flaw in the Ralph Stacey model, which is the bottom box is not predictive; it's the line organization.
It is. You're right.
And the big problem with that graphic, it's the smallest box on
which
the graphic,
is the vast majority of the work we do.
It's the biggest box, right?
Yep.
So that's one aspect. But what I love his his concept where he has what's called House of Pain or Chaos, that red zone
the
over
chaos
there,
up in the upper right corner. Yep.
where it says kind of like don't bother, nothing works here.
Yeah.
But I've actually seen Ralph Stacey models where somebody, I'm obviously a Kanban disciple, says what you have to use here is Kanban.
Is
what
Kanban.
do you have to say to that?
100% agreed.
Yeah?
Absolutely agreed. The way I view it is that the chaos space is kind of like research and development, right? Chaos doesn't have to be bad. If you're doing R&D, chaos is good because you have no idea what you're going to work on. You have no idea what the experiment is going to prove. So it's constant chaos, but you still need to be able to manage that. And Kanban allows you to visualize the chaos, right? So absolutely agree 100% with that concept. You build a Kanban board. In fact, I've done this multiple times with R&D kinds of organizations. Put them up on a Kanban board just to visualize who's working on what and what's being impeded. As an example, let's say you need to conduct an experiment, but you don't have a piece of equipment that you need. I need to see that. I need it visible so I can go do something about it. So even in chaos, there's some visualization.
Okay, the way you're saying it makes it more endearing to me, because I think my objection was when I read it, it was kind of, I read it as a statement. All the other methodologies suck. We're the only ones who can do this. And actually Kanban doesn't guarantee that you can solve the chaos. It's just the most adaptive of methodologies to deal with the chaos.
And here's another way to think about it. Kanban is not a project management methodology at all, right? Ooh. It is a flow. It is a visualization tool. It's identifying your problems. And that's why you quite often see Kanban inside of other processes, because Kanban gives you the visualization.
Because you could do it actually for day-to-day work if your day-to-day work is good.
I use a personal Kanban board when I'm building classes and things like that. I keep all my work visualized. I do Kanban inside waterfall projects because it helps me visualize the problems.
Well, I think that the network diagram methodology is very, very closely aligned with it. And by the way, the number one thing that I miss in Scrum, you know, when you're estimating story points from tasks to user stories, I'm like, there's no way for you to know what the ideal time is without doing a rudimentary form of workflow or network diagram.
You got to have some kind of visualization. You got to have some kind of history in order to get some realistic view of what time is, right?
There was a second thing that I read in the Disciplined Agile book, which caught my attention, and it tickled my fancy. And I liked it to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent, because I don't think it's across the board advisory of what the future form of working will be. And I kind of felt it was a return to the past segment. And what it basically said was, and this is something I've always understood. I think a lot of project managers were not aware of this. There's a strong relationship between product management and project management, especially if you're producing products.
Yes.
A project lifecycle is a subsegment of the overall product lifecycle. We basically are I always use the analogy, if we were the space shuttle, we're the boosters that gets it to that level where it's stabilized and won't blow up, right? Has a certain speed and velocity, and then there's a better way of managing it. But one of the things it said in there, which I thought was very interesting, it said that kind of the future of working that we'll have to entertain is if you're going to create squads that are awesome and they produce a product. And I think it was originally in line with the IT principle, because the end of a project in IT is the beginning of a project, right? So if you're going to take the iPhone, for example, when you're finished with the first iPhone, you're going to continue working on the second.
It never ends.
It never ends. So this concept, which I always thought was highly artificial and sensible in some projects, but from an overall strategic standpoint is a handicap for project thinking. It said, we need to have this concept where we remove this artificial milestone of ending.
Yes, exactly.
And what you should theoretically do, you just basically said how important it is to develop a high performing team, and it takes time.
Critical. Yes.
Why would you want to discharge them? Why would you want to say, now go back to your line organization? Why not say, hey, listen, you're so valuable to the organization. Your lessons learned are valuable, and your lessons from the previous product iterations, you go into the next. So the concept in that they kind of purport in the discipline Agile was this concept that in the future, projects will not end and teams will not disband.
Yes, exactly.
What are your thoughts on that? You agree with that across the board?
Absolutely, 100% agree with that concept. Let's take Agile out of the picture for a moment.
Yeah.
Let's just organization. This is about organizational design, team topologies. It has very little to do with Agile. The only reason that Agile is in this conversation is because it was made really obvious and really prevalent in the framework that in order to make Agile work, you need these stable teams.
Yeah.
Right. So let's take Agile out for a second. Let's say you're a traditional organization. Now, I'm sure you've worked with a lot of organizations, Mark, tons of organizations, and they all do the same stupid thing. And that is, we have a project. Let's put a bunch of people on it that maybe don't know each other well. We've got some contractors and all these whatever. We throw them in a room together and say, go, and you must be on time.
And 30% of their effort is wasted on getting to know each other.
Exactly. It's the Tuckman model, right? Forming, storming, norming, performing, right? They got to form, they got to storm, they got to get to know each other. We tend to forget the human dynamic of building teams.
Yeah.
And they're very, very separate things. Frameworks, processes, all big, all good, all useful. But if you don't build a great high-performing team, your project is going to have a huge amount of risk.
Yeah.
Build your teams. Keep them stable as much as you can. Right? It doesn't mean they're going to be together forever, but keep them as stable as possible. Yeah. You still have the opportunity of bringing some people in and out if you need to, but keep them generally stable. The data becomes consistent. They become high performing. Their lessons stay within the team. They get tribal knowledge. There's all kinds of good stuff when you build that structure, that social structure of a team. That's what that is. Build a team of great people, and then your projects are going to have less risk as a result.
Actually, I'm just had a thought, which is a little bit of a deviation of what we're talking about, because we're talking about, continuing the product in the next iteration and the next iteration. But one example of this keep teams you can see in special forces, and
exactly.
I think you saw I had the real privilege of interviewing an American hero and former captain of a Navy SEAL team, SEAL team, not a teal team. A SEAL team, and I think they're a good analogy for it, because what you're doing is you're spending all this time training this team. Yeah. You don't disband them after every mission. You find the next mission and the next mission, because that's a form of scaled efficiency.
And you're building trust, which is that core. There's a book that I use quite often. I reference it all the time with coaching activities. It's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
I know it. Yes, awesome.
Great book.
Is that from John Maxwell?
No, it's not John Maxwell. He might include some of those concepts, but Patrick Lencioni is the
okay.
Anyway, he in this 5 dysfunctions, the base level of dysfunction is lack of trust. And I 100% agree with that. If you have people that can't trust each other, and I'm not talking about I trust someone to do their job, the level of trust where you can say, hey, buddy, I noticed you're not doing your job. Right? I notice you've got a problem. Something is going on. How can I help you? That level of trust where you can hold each other accountable, that's a higher level of a trust, right? That's sharing vulnerability. That's sharing, that kind of trust where you as a team can improve together as a team. You can get that when you just throw people in a room together. It's not going to happen.
Let me ask you a question, because it smacks a little bit in contrast to how many projects work. You have a line organization, you have a function in the line organization. You're picked for the project because you're a subject matter expert in your area, and you're contributing to the integrated knowledge aggregation of a team, right? I think one of the biggest things that PMOs suffer under is that they're a quasi-department.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
They have no real control.
I underline the word quasi 10 times, right? Why is it quasi? Because they don't really have their own resources. They don't have a serious budget. They don't have management representation on all 5 levels, right? So they're kind of the needed stepchild of the matrix organization.
Yes.
Now, what we are talking about with this discipline Agile, and maybe not just discipline Agile, also with the
most of the frameworks methodology,
and a lot of what's coming also out of the lean camp is why not create Agile high performance teams? And when I say Agile high performance teams, I'm not necessarily talking just project. It could be project, but it could be continual work. Would you be a proponent? Would you be supportive of the concept that regardless if it's under a VDO or a PMO or whatever structure it should be, or guild, whatever you want to call it, that it would be smart for organizations in the future to have a certain dedicated pool of resources that work on the out of the ordinary?
Yeah. And you absolutely could do that. You can build those, traditional SWAT teams, things like that. And let me say this, there are different structures that you can build with your teams. The traditional Agile structure is a cross-functional, developers, testers, and not just in the IT space, whatever. Bunch of people with different skills on the same team.
Yeah.
That's your primary team that you want to build out. Well, there are some cases where it just does not work.
Okay.
Right. Where that's not the right team. And, maybe you've got a skill set that is really hard to find, right? Maybe there isn't enough work in the organization.
That's another issue. You have to have the volume.
You got to have the volume, to handle the capacity, right? I don't want to go out there and, hire somebody at, $300 an hour and put them on every single team. And there's not enough work for them. How silly would that be, right?
Yeah.
So no, we don't do that. And so there's another structure that you can build where it's just those skill sets. Right. And those can be kind of like your SWAT teams, those specialty conditions, those teams that some things just don't fit.
Yeah.
Right. And it's great building these processes for the norm. And that's what we should do. But we should also consider those things that they just don't fit. Right. They happen.
Yeah. We've kind of alluded to the 3-dimensional matrix organization, the change, the project, and the line organization. Would you think that maybe a way of justifying dedicated resources in this area is to more closely align the change organization with the project organization?
I think they should be either the same thing working together. They should be a cross-functional team.
Yeah. I give you an example. One pharmaceutical company that I did work for, they actually had, they shared the same office space with an organization unit called OPEX. I'm like, what's that, operational expenditure? They go, no, it stands for operational excellence, which is a big word, right, for change, right? And they use basically lean methodologies, also the waste and stuff like that. Yeah. And I said, who came up with the idea that you guys should be sitting on the same floor? Because if it was intentional, it was brilliant. And if it was unintentional, it was unintentionally brilliant. Because that's exactly if you've got limited resources and you want to eliminate also redundancy, which I believe one of the ways that's not often enough addressed is the redundancy factor.
Yeah.
People doing the same thing with different processes, with different templates, and arguing about, no, my way is better than your way is a waste of time, if you ask me. It can help to create better processes, but if you never resolve it, it's a waste of time. Yeah. So you think that might be one way to kind of reaffirm that special team?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to throw another form of waste out there, which also that helps. That model you just put out there also helps to reduce waiting. Waiting is one of the first ones, right? Because that's the biggest form of waste, right? Waiting, if you're in different parts of the world, you need to send an email, you got to wait for a reply if they even see it. That wait time is non-value add time because you're not doing anything while you're waiting. Yeah, sure, you can go start something else, but what you've essentially done is reduced your productivity because now you've got increased WIP limits, you got all kinds of bad flow problems going on. So anytime you introduce waiting into a process, you've become less efficient.
I have this pet peeve, right? There's theoretically 8 MUDOs, right? 8 wastes.
Yes.
I think there's more. Do you agree?
Yeah, and there's also different waste in the manufacturing space than there's waste in the
absolutely
knowledge space.
Depends on what context, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw some, and I'm going to see if you appreciate them, because if you appreciate them, then that'll make me feel good, and I'd like to hear if you have any. So I always say that at least two of the MUDOs that I would add on to it is one that I already referred to was reinventing the wheel, right? Yeah. So you have a process, and then for some reason, somebody comes along and smashes a hammer on and says, this is bad, we need to do this. And then it's basically the same process, and you're wasting time retraining a team on something that they already knew how to do. That's one. And the other one I call smoke and mirrors. the concept of politics and lying to one another.
Bureaucracy.
Yes.
And not just the bureaucracy, but the dishonesty, if I can be so bold as saying that happens within those bureaucracies.
Yeah. So you agree that depending on the context that you're in, you can reshape them, and there's a couple ones that are probably not mentioned.
Yeah, and to me, it's more important that you recognize that waste is part of your process, and you need to do something about it.
I think that it's such a brilliant concept. It's such a brilliant concept because the simplicity of it. I think the real the true value, anything that takes a complex subject and simplifies it so that it becomes realizable, pragmatic. You can take action on it. That's what I love about what we do.
You said, Mark, I think it's a funny story, but it really hits. I know it'll hit home for you when I say this. So often as a coach, I get brought in to say, they say, oh, I want you to teach my teams how to do Agile, spin up these teams and you're good, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, okay, fine, we'll start here. And it's always the starting point. You start with these teams and you spin them up. And after a period of time, maybe a few months, they start recognizing that the teams are more productive, but they're still not producing more. There's more, right?
Yeah.
And that's when they start recognizing there's organizational problems that are slowing those teams down. And those problems have always been there.
Yeah.
They're not new because you're bringing Agile. It's just Agile is now saying, look right here, you've got a problem. Let's go fix this. And that's the real power of whatever framework you're using. It doesn't make any difference, right? It's recognizing and visualizing where your problems are. The biggest problems that I find when I go into organizations, it's not the teams, right? Yes, you can make the teams more efficient, no question. But the real problems, the real waste I see is initiating work. That from idea to actually starting the work is huge amounts of waste. Waiting for sign-offs, waiting for approvals, waiting for
the number one waste is waiting forever for decisions that should have been made a long time ago while your team is sitting on their hands and you've got costs running.
Exactly. How many times have you seen projects where 6 months is spent initiating the project and then 3 months actually building the thing? Yeah. Right. It's crazy.
Absolutely.
That's your waste.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So let's get your thoughts on lean. I'm in love with lean. I've got a whole part of my shelf that's dedicated to lean books. For me, it was an absolute no-brainer that the future development of project management skill sets has to be aligned with the whole concept of fusing the lean philosophy with project management. I think 100%. Project management is more the execution part of it, and lean is more the analytic or business analysis part of that. I think it's unquestionable.
No question whatsoever. And I think lean is not just in the project management space. Where I see a lot of value in lean is also in the portfolio. Yeah. Right. So one of the challenges that a lot of organizations have is they have this portfolio of projects, right? That's how they view a portfolio. Lean portfolio is a little bit different. You view it as a portfolio of investments. Yeah. And I know that sometimes, words are similar. It's a different way of looking at it, but it's an investment of capacity, investment of knowledge. It's an investment that you're spending. Yeah. The challenge though, is that we tend to invest too much, right? You look at your WIP organizationally, not just within the team. Yeah. If you've got an organization that's, a mid-sized company and they've got 500 projects going on.
Yeah. Okay. Now I understand what you mean.
Way too much.
We kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. We think, hey, more is better.
Yes.
And we're actually wasting. It's another form of waste because you don't have the resource capacity, the coordination capacity, or the organizational capacity to manage that much work in progress.
And think how it manifests. We start multitasking in the teams. We don't have a prioritized list of work because everything is so important. So we've started the problem right at the top. And then it manifests.
I agree with that. I think lean definitely has to become part of the overall portfolio thing. And I think there's so much space for it because I think probably the weakest link in the 3 Ps, the PPPM that I always refer to, is the portfolio thing. I'm always shocked when I talk to senior executives and I say, listen, how many projects do you have in your portfolio? And they look at me
first thing I do. Yep.
And I say, well, what's your annual budget for projects? How many of those projects are OPEX and how many of them are CAPEX, if that's the vocabulary that you use? Or how many of them are internal? How many of them are external? How many of them are strategic? How many of them are impact oriented? How many of them are return of investment oriented? And people look at me like, I don't know. I have to ask my assistant. And then you ask the assistant, says, I don't know.
Because they're not tracking it probably.
Yeah. And that's a shock to me. That's a shock to me that I think that I think all executives would, this is what's a big shock to me still today. And I'm going to get some bad vibes from some listeners on this, or maybe some laughs. I would say 100%, hand out, 100% of executives have a concept of project.
So define, what do you mean a concept of projects?
Well, they have a
Have they
concept that
internalized
a
it?
project would be a necessary vehicle
Yes.
for something that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
A special event, an initiative, a special focus. I think that concept is solid. And now I'm going to go on thin ice. Of those 100%, and this I'm being optimistic, 10% understand and know what project management.
They think of a project as scope, schedule, budget.
No, I think even worse. I think, and I've had this discussion with my dad many, many years ago, who was an executive himself. I think they just think that it's an extension of management in general and don't see that it's anything different and why they should focus on a different. So that's why
like that
when
view.
you ask an executive how many projects you have, what do I care? Somebody knows. I don't know, but somebody does. I'm like that, you know? So let me ask you another question. Let's dive into the Agile thing, because there's a bunch of pet peeves that I've had on Agile, and you have.
Yeah, because I want to dive into that project concept as well. So let's.
Okay, no, go ahead. Go ahead. Let's start off with that.
So you might have caused a couple of comments to happen as with your comments. let me throw some more comments.
Good.
Might throw some things out there as well. Whenever possible, I try to remove the project construct in organizations. That doesn't mean 100%.
Okay.
Right. But if possible, 100%, I do actually have, and we talked about this, I have a few organizations, they don't do projects at all. There's no
I don't know if I like you on that, but keep talking.
I know, that's why I said this, right? Let's talk about this. But the challenge is that a lot of organizations view that every piece of work, most work, right, not the operational stuff, a lot of work has to be done with a project. It has to be scope, schedule, budget, milestones, dates, it has to be managed, all these kinds of things. And I disagree with that concept. Okay. Some projects need that. If there's lots of complexity, lots of organization involvement, go ahead and build a project. I got no problem with that. But the vast majority of the work an organization does is really no different than enhancements. And enhancements are typically not done as projects. It's usually under a certain budget level. And they just say, you need an enhancement, go do it.
Yeah.
Now, there needs to be management.
And there'll be elements of project-esque work. Yes. You might use some of the tools, but it's not the same complexity, the same level of micromanagement, the same level of coordination.
The initiation's faster. The budgeting is different, which is, money drives an organization. How you organize your money is going to be how you're going to organize your company as well, your teams and everything. So it changes the budgeting module, the budgeting method.
Well, if you can assign it to a business unit or a department and cover it with those resources, I would agree with you. But if you're talking about cross-functional teams, I would disagree with
you. So let's dive into that for a moment. So let's say that we build a collection of cross-functional teams, right? And maybe some other teams out there as well that are not, right? Collection of cross-functional teams. Now, these teams are, let's say, product focused, because that's the Agile view of product focused. To me, it's more business focused. Yeah. Right. So they're business focused, meaning I can give them a business thing I need done, and I hand it to them, and they're able to do it with very little interaction from other teams. Right. Not no interaction, but limited. Right. So I can give them a business capability or business function. They go off and they can do it. You build out a series of those teams. Now I've got a series of features or capabilities that I need to do. Not with projects. I just say, I've got this thing I need to do. That's the right team to go do it, because they have the skills, the business domain. Let's put it onto their backlog, and they just do it. Yeah. Right. Initiation is faster. The budgeting is easier. You're not building teams and tearing them down. You've just got a collection of stable teams that you're constantly feeding business.
You know where I think that happens inherently in organizations? In what I call submarine projects.
Okay, go deeper.
Okay, so if we're following the mandate that a project is a legitimate thing and it has to be identified and it has to be approved by a higher up, okay, then you already have a problem that you're creating a funnel, and there's always going to be a business unit manager who's ticked off that his or her project didn't get selected. But in German, we say every business unit leader is a king unto or queen unto themselves, right? Yeah. I've got resources. I've got budget. I don't have to
do it myself.
There's a famous story. I think it was of the Joe factory in France, where they wanted to build a new production hall, and it was above the budget limit They would have had to go to headquarters, and headquarters said, we're not. So what they did is they approved it in releases. So they approved the chimney and they approved this. And then when it added up, and the funny thing, what came out is that when headquarters came for a spot visit, they showed the factory and said, where'd this come from? Who approved this?
And that's,
so I think that's inherent that these enhancements happen, and I think they should be in the purview of business unit leaders to do that. But I'm telling you where my emotional resistance to avoiding the project construct is. I think we've been fighting for so many decades to give project management its due and create awareness and respect for the discipline. I know a lot of organizations that have done what you're talking about. You're no longer allowed to use the word projects, but they still have them.
Yeah, and that happens all the time, right? At least in here, it's still a project.
That's screwy. That's really a problem, because now they have nothing. They don't have a mandate. They have no power. There's no formalisms, but they're constantly tortured by people's expectations.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that. And I put that in the same boat as, organizations, just like teams, need time to mature, to learn, change terminology, change their understanding. So you escort them through that process, so they no longer need to fall on that project construct anymore. And again, I want to repeat, I have no problems with projects. Certainly there are cases absolutely valid. It's just, I think we overdo it. I think there are just some things that, if you give an annual budget of $10 million, the business unit should be able to just say, you know what, I need this. And they should just be able to do it.
I would agree with you. I think I've actually even heard PMI CEOs totally embarrass themselves on camera by saying everything is a project. I'm like, what did you just say? Well, your marriage is a project. No, it might be a program, but I hope it's not a project. Right?
Absolutely.
Your wedding might be a project, but that's a different story. So I think what we're basically saying is you should avoid projectitis.
Yes,
and I think there's some legitimacy. I think there's a gray area where we can consider whether the form. I think a lot of people also look at project management as black and white. It's either line organization, project. And I think we will all agree. I had this discussion with somebody. It's more like 50 Shades of Gray, and in reality, it's not even gray. It's different colors. So I think that,
and we're typically colorblind. So
let me pick up another thing that I hear, and I've heard you say this, that Agile is not a project management methodology. Please expand. See who we can tick off with that statement.
Yeah. So let's start with Kanban, and then let's go up a little bit.
Okay.
So the framework of Kanban has absolutely nothing to do with project management. It doesn't have initiation. It doesn't have no concept of building teams. It has no concept of deadlines.
So it's actually a crossover methodology.
It's you're literally just visualizing the flow of work. That's all the Kanban is.
And you can use it in a project context or in a non-project context, which is a brilliant tool.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I use it for my own personal work. I don't do projects when I'm building a course or whatever. It's just work I do, right? So that has nothing to do with project management. However, you can make use of it as a tool using a PMI concept, right? It's a tool-based approach. So Kanban is a tool that can enhance your project management skills, right? And treat it that way. Scrum similarly. Scrum now has more concepts that are closer to project management, but there's nothing in Scrum that talks about initiating the work. There's nothing in Scrum that says when to hand it over to operations. Nothing about any of the fate. Nothing of that exists.
Well, you have the releases. So in reality, what Scrum is basically taking one project and making multi-projects out of it. That's kind of how
kind of. But even a release is an optional activity, right? It is not required to be part of Scrum. It just doesn't have any real. The project construct doesn't exist in Scrum. That doesn't mean that you can't have a project in Scrum. It's just that Scrum does not define it. Right? So none of them really are project management constructs. None of them. Not XP, Bristol, none of them. None of them are really project management frameworks. You typically need to have some other things that you put on top of it.
So what you're saying is the concept that Agile is not project management. What you understand under that statement is not the Agilists trying to make themselves special or better than the traditional project managers. It's just them saying, listen, our toolkit goes to such an extreme that it crosses over to the other side and also provides value to the other side. And that's why agile thinking should also be part of your change management and your operational management.
It should
part
be
of your lean concept.
Agile thinking is organizational wide, right?
Yeah.
And it's, again, not Scrum should be organization and Kanban should be, although Kanban could be organizationally, but it's not about those frameworks. It's about it's that way of working, right? It's about thinking about how we do work, think about waste, think about flow, think about capacity and prioritization, all of those concepts. Now, and similarly, it's just like, I think you need some project management things over top of your frameworks. You also need project management skills on those things, right? And it something I think that we did wrong in the Agile community years and years ago. We said, well, we don't need project managers. You've got Scrum Masters. What a bad idea, right? Half of these Scrum Masters, they had no project management skill set, no background whatsoever. You still need to organize and manage complexity. You still need to communicate with stakeholders. And the product owner can help out with these things. And let's be honest, you don't always need a project manager. If something is small and easy, do you really need a project manager?
No.
Probably not, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you should never have one.
Yeah.
Right. So
actually, this one organization I referred to, they went extreme from traditional to agile, from these agile tribes. And then they had about 150 project managers that all legitimately asked the question, listen, I've been working for you for the last 15 years as a project manager. What's my job right now?
What's my job?
They basically try to talk them into, well, they'll be Scrum Masters. And
Terrible.
they asked me what a Scrum Master was. And I said, well, it's a project. I made the mistake of saying a project assistant, and they were deeply offended. And I meant, well, a facilitator. And they were still deeply offended. And they say, no, our Scrum Masters are senior project management consultants.
What?
I'm like, that's not what your projects need. They need people who have feet on the ground, that can get things done. In the military, you have the concept of officers for the high end, blah, blah, and then you have NCOs that get things done. Warrant officers that get things done.
That's supposed to be the Scrum Master.
Relationship with the soldiers. It's the same principle in Agile. So let me ask you, this is another one of my pet peeves. I think we've mentioned this before. It drives me nuts when I hear this, and it's a very self-aggrandizing statement from the Agile community. And it's the statement, it's more important to be Agile than do Agile. Now, I'm probably misinterpreting and I'm getting into the wrong windpipe here. But what is your feeling on that? Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that horribly overused and misused statement.
Yes.
Right. I completely agree with the concept. So here's what they're really saying. Doing Agile is, I'm using a tool, I'm using Scrum, I'm doing
using
daily
some
Scrums.
form of Agile methodology, be it Scrum, Kanban, or something else.
The operationalization of it.
Yes.
Right. You're doing
the process.
Scrum. Exactly. The process itself.
Yeah.
So yes, doing Scrum is maybe step one.
Yes.
Right. Beyond that, once you get beyond just doing Agile, now you start thinking about thinking Agile. This is where it's more agility than Agile.
So it's kind of a manifesto thing. The one thing is not negating the other. It's just setting priorities. Then I would accept it, because what I used to always say is you're not a marathon runner unless you run kilometers.
It's true. Yes.
You can talk about it all day long. I identify he, him, they, her, she, them. I identify as a marathon runner, but I don't run. And I don't know anything about running. Then you're not a marathon runner. So that was my take on it. Yeah,
exactly. And it was really, really funny, Mark. So I have this slide that I use when I'm showing organizations the difference. And it's the slide, it's a glacier, the typical, the tip, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? So the tip is really just doing Agile. It's like, all right, you're doing Scrum, you're doing dailies, you're doing retrospectives.
Which a lot of people find tedious until they actually embrace and understand why they're doing it.
And it's the internalizing of those concepts, right? Doing them, they're going to get tedious. Understanding why you do them. Now you're getting to that next level, a higher level of awareness, right? You're starting to understand why you're doing that stuff, right? It's the stuff underneath that's really the important stuff. Things like, so let me give you an example. If your organization does not value the concept of learning, experimentation, risk aversion versus risk recovery, right? If you're averse to risk, you're going to have a real hard time with Agile, right? you need to be focusing more on recovery.
Yeah.
There are these core principles and values that are underneath the frameworks that honestly, I don't care if you do Scrum or Kanban or follow any of the Agile frameworks. Yeah. If you do that other stuff, you stick with waterfall, right? You'll still be better off because you're thinking in a different way. That's agility, right? That's an enterprise thing. It's not a team thing. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Let me ask you another daring question. Will Agile replace predictive?
No.
Are there scenarios where Agile makes very little sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm with you. We won't even expound on that. I agree with you. I have one of my favorite examples, one of my favorite clients that I was actually training today, a large IT company that has amazing, complicated projects, but projects that they repeat almost in series. Okay. And because they're an IT company, their sponsors, their external sponsors are IT departments. They think, oh my God, we have to be state of the art. So because this company is an IT company, it has to work Agile. But in reality, it knows exactly how to predict the roadmap, the schedule, the cost.
Isn't that the simple space, right? From the Stacy model? That's right. That's the simple space. It's repeatable. Right?
So, okay. So that's now let's get on to the one of our later but important topics. And you kind of, when we discussed about what we could talk about, you'd mentioned something that I thought was a hot topic. And the hot topic that you mentioned is, what is the future of Agile? Mm-hmm. Care to expound a little bit?
Yeah. So the audience might have heard some things, read some things. Some recent news over the past couple of years that there have been some weird things going on in the Agile space. And some organizations are actually letting go of their Agile roles. Like got rid of I know several organizations got rid of all of their Scrum Masters, every single one of them, right?
I know a lot of organizations that never had them in the first place.
There's that too, yeah. But I wouldn't call them, they were Agile and now you get the point, right? Yeah. So this is a weird little thing that's going on, right? So the industry is definitely changing. Now, I personally don't view it as a bad thing that they're taking these steps as long as they're doing them for the right reasons, right? If they're not saying we're no longer going to do Agile, or if they're using getting rid of people in a role as an excuse when they're really just laying people off, those are not the right reasons to get rid of roles.
So you see, a number of organizations that are letting their Agile roles go.
Yes.
What are they going to? Are they not doing projects anymore, or what model are they going back to?
So interesting, what I've heard from these organizations is their response is, we are already so Agile as an organization that we don't need the roles.
That is such a lame excuse.
It's kind of like saying we are Agile so we don't need project managers. It's the same thing to me. Okay. Now, let me temper that a little bit, because quite honestly, I think the role, I'm going to say something that's likely going to get me in a little bit of trouble with the Agile.
Good. I love those statements.
I think the Scrum Master role is overutilized, right? There has been
or underutilized, once again, depending on, it goes in both extremes.
Well, overutilized meaning that we try to have too many Scrum Masters. This is really what I mean. Sorry, I should be more specific. So in the past, there's been a view that every team must have a Scrum Master. Yeah. And it should be a 1-to-1 ratio. I've never really fully agreed with that concept.
When it really depends on the size of the project.
Yeah, exactly. And also the maturity of the team.
Yeah,
if the team has been doing Agile for 7 years, do they really need a Scrum Master?
No.
They don't need one, right? Yeah. So, my view has always been that the team needs someone to facilitate improvement, them becoming a more Agile team, facilitating better behaviors, better process, facilitating the process itself. We need somebody to help with that concept. But over time, part of that person's job as, Scrum Master or whatever you want to call them, is to make it so that they really shouldn't be necessary anymore.
Okay.
So the team is doing it themselves, right? If the team is thinking that way and they're just behaving well and trusting each other, then the need of a Scrum Master is actually very little, right? Now, that doesn't go well with the narrative that, hey, let's build a whole bunch of Scrum Masters. You've got a job progression when part of the job is to make yourself not have a job, right? And at least for that particular team anyway.
Yeah.
So I think they've gone too much with Scrum Masters.
Yeah.
Way too many of them.
Yeah.
And they've manufactured so many Scrum Masters coming out of the the certification
Well,
engine.
I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna get pissed people off now. I only bothered to do. We won't name the organization. I only
Yep.
bothered to do the certified Scrum Master. It was a great course. The trainer was
Yep.
sensational. He'd written a book. Lots of giveaways. 30 people in a room for 2 days. Good food, fun exercises. We got to cheat on the exam, which
Did
was
you
called
learn?
Agile.
Yeah.
I didn't because I found it confusing to have all these people talk. I went outside and finished the exam. But my impression was this was my hardcore. I really felt bad for about 28 people of the 30 people because my impression was there were 2 people in the room who actually knew how to apply what they just covered. That was me and one other person. And the only reason why we did is because we had already been doing it in some formal or informal
Exactly.
sense already. And all the course provided was a formalized framework and vocabulary to put it into context.
Yep.
But the other 28%, if I were to ask them, hey, listen, give me how do you create story points, they wouldn't be able to do it.
Of course. Absolutely. And even people coming out of it, after passing the exam, and let's be honest about something also. Let's just a real quick point. Story points are not part of Scrum. Not in the Scrum guide, but they teach it as part of it. I'm not saying don't use story points. I'm saying I have a lot of problems with the way they teach Scrum.
I still prefer duration and effort, whether people like it or not.
You can use that as well, right? It's whatever works for you.
Yeah.
But my own story when I took my certification, went in, took the 2-day class. Good teacher, good knowledge. I gained a lot of information, and got the certification. All cool. Went off, did my first project, and failed miserably. I mean, just absolute failure. And it was at that point where I realized I absolutely don't know anything about this. So I realized a 2-day class and
Not
get 3 letters behind your name is not enough to make you an expert.
Yeah.
And that was my oops. Yeah. All right. So then I went out, I took the class again with a different trainer, not because one was better than the other, just because I wanted to hear it from someone else.
Yeah.
Right. And then I practiced more.
And you asked different questions, I'm sure, the second time around.
I had a very different perspective. Right. So I asked different questions. I brought somebody into my organization that had knowledge to help coach me. Yeah. Right. So I got knowledge. Right. And then the courses, the certifications give you some level of knowledge, but you need the experience to actually be able to do it. Right.
Let me ask you a question. This is my impression. This is something I always say. If you embrace the Agile methodology, one of the things that you have to realize that you're embracing is that it's a more complicated project management methodology than predictive is. Would you agree?
It is, but it shouldn't have to be. And the reason I say that is that the organizational dynamics tend to put far more controls in place than an Agile project really needs, right? Here's why I say that. There's a lot of organizational scarring that tends to happen.
Yeah.
It's like, 6 years ago, somebody did something, so we put a policy in place, right? Can't let that ever happen again, right? Well, that thing couldn't possibly happen in an Agile team because the Agile team is different than a waterfall team. They are different. So trying to put the same traditional governance on top of an Agile team fails miserably. So we tend to spend a lot of time trying to map what you're doing in Agile to this governance that isn't really designed for it. So yes, it becomes more complex. Does that make sense?
I don't know if I would agree with you 100% because I find that most of the teams that I manage are not that different from one another. I think for me across the board, one methodology. I'll tell you what my approach to Agile is, and it probably offends some Agilists. I think the true value, and I think there's a lot of value to Agile. I think that the number one value of predictive, I think it's superior when it comes to initiation and planning, if it's done right.
If it's done properly.
If it's done right, if it's not exaggerated, and it's done swiftly with the right processing, I think it's superior when it comes to high level planning.
Yes, and then the key there also is bring the right people.
Yeah, but then the key here is high level. And the problem is we agree on the high level. We all nod our heads and shake hands and pat each other in the back and think, this is going to be easy. And then we get to execution. And traditional project management doesn't understand that project management is not initiation and planning, although 80% of it in the PMBOK is.
Yep. Okay. It's the other stuff that's
it's actually execution. And
Agreed.
hands down, the superior method for execution in my book is Agile.
Absolutely agree.
because it deals with the next level of accuracy.
Yeah.
And it engages with the day-to-day stuff, and that's where the magic happens. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the plan.
And one of the core concepts in what you're just describing is something that actually came from Lean, and that is you delay your decisions until the last responsible moment. With responsible being very important, right? It's like you don't know everything up front. Stop pretending you do.
Yeah.
Right. So just delay your decisions until you have enough knowledge where you can actually make a good decision. And that's how Agile works, right? You're in the delivery space. But even in that case, yes, I agree that Agile, it does a really good job in the execution. The challenges that we face in an Agile team when you're first moving into an organization that doesn't really do Agile that well is the organizational dynamics resist it.
Oh, absolutely.
They resist it completely. The egos, you can imagine you got a stakeholder and you tell the stakeholder, look, we're not going to define everything at the beginning. We're just going to start building stuff. And so, well, when's it going to be done? Well, we think it's going to be done here. No, I need to know exactly. I need to know every single requirement and every single dollar and every single person. It doesn't work.
What you're talking about, you can't do Agile if both ends of the spectrum don't accept it. If the commissioning part, if the sponsor level says, okay, you're going to do Agile, but I'm going to do whatever the heck I want, that's not how it works.
It's not going to work.
Both parties have to be Agile.
Yeah, and it's not that you can't give dates, and it's not that you can't give a good idea of when things are going to be done. It's just,
but it means something different.
It's
They're
different.
Estimates.
Yes,
they're loose estimates.
They are.
So
estimates.
this is when we had the preliminary discussion. One of the things you said is there's a discussion out there on whether or not Agile will survive. That's kind of the wording you use.
Yes.
And this was my perspective on it, because I had a similar thing that I used to say, and I'm saying it maybe from a different perspective. The reason I think that there's a great danger, there's a self-destruction function in Agile that's dangerous, is it's an absolute hype.
Yes.
90% of the people who use it don't have a concrete understanding what it means to do it.
Yep.
They have completely overblown, unrealistic expectations of what Agile does. And if you look at Jeff Sutherland's book, Faster, Quicker, Cheaper, typical American BS, if you ask me, right?
Hate that title. It's a
American.
good book, but I hate the title.
Yeah. It's like, oh my God, who are you trying to sell? That's some NLP stuff. And I think what inevitably is going to happen is that executives are going to be disenfranchised or unhappy with the results. Yeah. And I think that the hammer could come down from way up top, and they're just going to axe these people.
Yeah.
And then what's going to happen? Because we have burnt earth with predictive, we're going to have burnt earth with Agile. What's going to come next? A new model called fragile, Agile, schmagile, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to start again from the beginning, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have the same problems and similar solutions with different names.
And 20 years later, we're going to have the same conversation. Will it survive?
Would you agree that that's a potential threat that we have there?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me say this also. So there are lots of conversations, lots of discussions going on about, what's going to happen to Agile. Yeah. And I think the really important part is that we have the discussion.
Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about it, because is Agile perfect? Absolutely not. Is waterfall traditional, predictive? No. Not at all. I've seen lots of failures.
It's a means to an end.
The means to an end. It's a way of managing work, a way of getting stuff done. And you need to do it well, whether you're whatever framework, you need to do it well.
Yeah.
And the organization needs to support it. So having the conversations is important. Do I think Agile is done or going to be done? No, I don't.
It might come back under a different name, but
yeah. And it's funny, Mark, I do that all the time. I go with an organization, you're going through a transformation, and it's like, Agile. Everyone gets tired of the word. They're just so horribly tired of the word. So we call it something else.
Well, language, this is something I think we need to appreciate. Every language has evolved over time. Every new generation has to take ownership of the language. So it evolves with time. I mean, there's a big difference between Shakespearean and English today, right? Yeah. And I think that if that's part of the process, then I don't have a problem with it. But like I said, it's the waste that I object to.
Now I do agree also with the comment you made about it's overhyped. Let's face it. Anytime you have something new, it's a boon for consultants. Yeah. Right. I'm a consultant. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I've made money off.
But we're the good kind.
Yeah. Well, I like to think so. Right. It's like, but the reason that I do this work is to actually cause positive change, right? And should I make money off it? Of course I should.
Yes.
Right? I don't do this because I'm independently wealthy, right?
Yeah.
But there are consulting agencies that take significant advantage over this. And they just, the worst kind are the ones that come in and they say, we're going to install this framework. We're going to show you how this is done.
We have a trademark on it.
We have a trademark in our special version of Agile. And we're going to install it. And when we're done, you're good to go. We're going to leave and you're going to be Agile. And no, you're not. You will fail miserably.
Yeah.
Because it's not about hiring a bunch of consultants to install something in your organization. Yeah. It's the people in the organization that needs to go through the transformation to let you transform.
You know, I think you said something really, really important that I try to remind people of. I think it's the illusion that if we commit to whatever form of project management that we commit to, we have this misconception. Oh, if I do this, if I do what Roy says or anybody else says, then I'm going to be successful. And I go, no, you're not.
You will fail. I will guarantee you
will still fail.
Yes.
You don't use a professional method to do something because it's a guarantee for success, but it should hopefully and most definitely increase the probability of success.
Exactly right. In my view, with the things that these things that we encourage people to do is with Agile actually is not going to fix your problems. You've got tons of organizational problems, right? Agile doesn't fix them. But what Agile does do is say, here are your problems. Yeah. These are the things to look at.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those values or that motivation to go fix those problems, you're going to just say, well, Agile's not working for us. Well, of course it's not.
What I love about what you're saying there is also something I would agree with. And it's the bad news and the good news of the project management methodology.
Exactly. Yep.
It's not an autopilot system.
Yep.
It's a process, is a process, and a process doesn't think. What makes the process work is human initiative and human intelligence.
Yes.
So you can have two project managers that are equally trained, and one will be successful with what he or she is doing, and the other will fail. Partly it's the context, partly it's luck, but often it's the understanding. Do I use a dogmatic administrative process and blame the process? Why isn't the process working? Or do I have this, as we say in French, je ne sais quoi, the unknown,
the intangible, right?
The spirit, the soul, the intelligence. And they say, listen, I need to put the tool aside and I have to have a real conversation with this person now.
Yeah, I got to talk to someone.
I got to talk to somebody. I got to reach out. I need to work on a different level here. I need to do some team building over here. I need to do this. I need to use the tool in a different context, or maybe I need to mix it up, right? I think that's what a lot of people, and I think that's the true beauty, is that these processes will all not substitute us. They will not replace us. They're meant to augment us. I think that's the positive message.
Put in the context of traditional project management, and I've seen this, I'm sure you've seen this tons of times as well. If you follow the framework, the traditional predictive approaches, you're going to have a chance at success, right? Yeah. But imagine you've got a project manager that dutifully creates their risk register, which they go through the whole process, but then never does anything to mitigate those risks. Yeah. Great, you followed the process, but how is it any better?
Yeah.
It's not helping you, right?
Yeah. It's just a means to an end.
Yeah.
One of the things we like to ask our guests, are there any books? You've already mentioned one, okay? The 5 Dysfunctions of Leadership. We'll definitely put a picture of that up, put that in the link. Are there any books that you would otherwise recommend to our listeners and viewers?
So I've got some good ones. One that I've reread it a couple of times now. It's called Sooner, Safer, Happier.
Okay.
Really good book. It's relatively new. I think it was released maybe about 2 years ago now. Very, very good. And it talks about some of the anti-patterns that you see in transformations. It's even calling it a transformation is technically an anti-pattern. And it's really, really good stuff. I
like that term, anti-pattern.
Yeah. So the anti-pattern, for the audience, if you're not familiar with that term, it's doing something that you feel is absolutely the right thing to do when it turns out it's actually the wrong thing to do. Right? That's the concept of an anti-pattern. Agile's filled with anti-patterns.
Okay.
So that's one. I also I like to read a lot of books that aren't just about, Agile and things like that. One of my favorite books is called Eat That Frog.
Oh, I know that one. Yeah.
Great book, right? It's about procrastination. Huge procrastinator. I have to remind myself frequently, so I reread that quite often. just to get myself back into patterns, things like that.
I heard somebody give a very glib but funny definition of procrastination. What do you call it? Procrastination is the assassination of motivation.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, that's definitely me.
I think
that's why I have a Kanban
we all
board.
struggle. No matter how productive you are, there are times when you procrastinate. It's part of the process.
Exactly. So those are my big book recommendations.
Okay. But you've written some yourself, right?
I have. There's a book that I wrote with a friend of mine. So I actually, believe it or not, I actually co-teach the PMP with another person. So I'm not just Agile. I teach the Agile part of the PMP, right?
Yeah.
So I wrote a book on it's called Project Management Bootcamp, right? So that's a good book. I'm actually writing another book right now, and this one's it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with capabilities. I need to find a good title. Don't have a good title for it yet, but it's about capability management, capability planning related to.
We can talk offline. We'll throw some titles on the wall.
I need a better title, because my title right now is strategic capability planning, which stinks,
that's not sexy.
Right? It's not sexy at all. So I need to come up with a better one. But the concept is, not all organizations have products; they have capabilities, and you want to be able to tie that to strategy.
I like that, because you mentioned it at the beginning. I think that would be a hot topic to go into greater depth.
Yep.
Roy, time has flown by. We've actually spent quite a bit of time talking, but it seems like it was like 5 minutes ago that we started.
It went fast. It was great.
It went fast, as always. As predicted, it's always a joy to talk with you, and I'm sure we'll catch up several times more. And when you write your book, we'll definitely have you back, maybe even before that. Then you can tell us the morsels of wisdom that you've derived from your book. But I want to say, listen, thanks a lot for your wealth of knowledge and your sharing and your great way to analyze things and look at it from a a neutral perspective. I like the fact that you embrace the fact it's just a means to an end. It's a great means to an end, but it shouldn't be over-evaluated. And the more flexible we are, the more agile we are, also with our methodology, the better we can become as managers. Okay. Do you guys have any questions? We have. Oh yeah, we have a question. So what we often do in this session too is I let my crew. The great thing about my crew here is they're not from our discipline. So when they listen, if they're falling asleep, I know whether it's going good. They're still awake.
That's good.
And then their questions are always brilliant because they ask it from kind of the third party.
Mark, I always find that people that are not in our industry get it so much better than we do.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the first thing you want to do is try to reduce it as much as possible, which is the hardest thing to do, right? Reducing it, unplanned work, those interruptions absolutely destroy your productivity, right? So anything you can do to try to say, maybe like I have certain hours where I'm more available, to try to maybe get some more focus time, right? There's also a technique that's called, Mark, I know you're aware of this, the Pomodoro technique.
Yeah.
Right? Use the Pomodoro technique, where you get 30 minutes of focused activities to reduce those interruptions. That said, of course, you're going to get interruptions, right? So what you'll typically do is just learn how much of those interruptions or how many of those are happening during a day, and just treat that as a layer of your capacity. I figure that every day I'm going to spend an hour of doing just interruptions, and accept that that's what it is. It's not worth writing it down, because it'll take you more time to write it down than actually just doing the work. So just treat it as a layer of peanut butter, right? It's just a layer of capacity that you can't get back. Yeah. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's a hot topic. I didn't realize that that's sometimes an issue, because they have this concept of open workspace, and it's so engaging, and you have osmotic learning. But I like your term white noise, because it's basically people are often just walking in and dumping their thoughts on you and then leaving, and then you're totally distracted for 15 minutes, and it takes you a while to get back on track, which is a huge productivity killer.
I think it's funny that, to me, those open spaces are the single greatest reason to buy noise canceling earphones, right? They are terrible for productivity. They're not designed properly. They've been recognized as one of the worst structures to put in place. They're better structures. One of them is called commons and caves, where you have, certain common areas, but even those are still isolated with a smaller group. And then you have caves where you can go off and be one of, just by yourself for a little bit. Those open spaces don't work well.
Yeah, I think if the open workspaces are too close to the rest of the organization, then we've got a serious problem. We actually, In
Yeah.
one of the projects I worked in, I remember I used to have 3 different desks that I would work off depending on
Yeah.
what project I was assigned to. And there was there were time frames when I was at this desk or that desk. And the reason why the facility management insisted on, if you were assigned to a project, you get a separate on a different floor, and the whole design of the workspace was different.
Was around the project.
So you felt, and people didn't know where you were because they knew the people that knew you from a different context knew you at that desk, but when you were at a different desk, they didn't bother you.
So another technique that we use often when you've got those big open space concepts is you put up a red flag, right? Some kind of an indicator.
Yeah.
Your red flag means I am not open for business.
Yeah.
Don't bother me right now.
Our project manager used to have an open door policy, but he had a lit lamp, and if that was on, it was don't bother.
Leave me alone,
Yeah,
right? And I think it's fair. Everybody deserves to have some focus time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Rico, do you have any questions? Rico's good.
Excellent. Mark, thank you so much for having me on. A lot of fun. I always enjoyed talking with you. So thanks.
Okay. All the best.